Luke chapter 1, picking it up at verse 57. We are continuing our study, this series, which is called Hope. And the reason that we are in a series is because it's Christmas time. That's what we're doing. We've got a Christmas series going on. And why is it called Hope? Because Christmas is hope. Okay, we're not talking about, I hope I get that gift that I want, or that pair of shoes that I want for Christmas, or I hope my mom and dad get me such and such, or I hope my team wins in the World Cup, or I hope that I pass my finals this week. We're not talking about iffy things that there's a chance of these things happening. When the Bible talks about hope, it is a sure thing. And the fact that Jesus, some 2,000 years ago, was born into the world tells us for a fact that there is hope. The birth of Jesus brings and gives hope, and Jesus is hope. I can remember where I was 29 years ago on September 15th. September 15th, 29 years ago. I was in a hospital in San Bernardino, and my first daughter was being born. And I can remember, you've got 9 months to prepare for this, right? 9 months. And I was there, I saw her, her stomach growing with that new baby in there. But being in the hospital room, the delivery room that day was something that was just absolutely extraordinary. Knowing that there was a baby in there is one thing. But to be in the room and see the baby coming out of someone else's body is a mind-blowing event. It's an extraordinary event. What we're looking at in this series is we're obviously running full steam ahead toward the birth of Jesus, the extraordinary event of the birth of Jesus. But what we've done is we've looked at a couple of other things surrounding the birth of Jesus. We started with a look at the Old Testament prophecies that happened, that were given about Jesus being born. But we also took a look at prophecies that were about 400 years before the birth of Jesus took place. Some prophecies concerning John the Baptist. Now, why John the Baptist? And we'll look at John the Baptist again this morning. But why John the Baptist? Because John the Baptist was a vital part of the Christmas story. God had promised that he would send Jesus, yes. But he also promised that he would send a forerunner into the world ahead of Jesus to prepare the way. Because God wanted to make sure that the world did not miss Jesus. And so in order for them not to miss Jesus, he sent a sign ahead of him, and that was obviously John the Baptist. Let me remind you, you do not have to turn there, but let me remind you about John the Baptist. We studied through this a week or two ago. But in Malachi chapter 3, through the prophet Malachi, the people were told this: "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me." That's something that Malachi the prophet spoke in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. That there's someone else coming. He's going to prepare the way for God. In Malachi chapter 4, at verse 5, it says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." As we'll find out, or as you find out when you get into the New Testament, he wasn't sending bodily Elijah, but what he meant was he's sending someone in the power and spirit of Elijah. Elijah was known to be a fiery, bold prophet. And what God was saying was he was going to send someone just like that. And sure enough, John the Baptist was that way, who stood out at the Jordan River, and when the religious elites came to him, he called them a bunch of snakes. He was that type of an individual. And Malachi it went on to say in chapter 4, verse 6, "And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse." So we had some details about John the Baptist about 400 years prior to. 400 years later, a man named Zacharias, a priest, was going into the temple to go and do his yearly service when he was approached by an angel who had some earth-shaking news for him, and that was that he was going to, not he obviously, but his wife, him and his wife were going to have a child. Why was that such a big deal? We'll find out this morning why that was such a big deal. For those of you that take notes, we're looking at verses 57 through 66. And you'll see that this is broken up into three main sections. We will see that this event, the birth of John, was characterized by an open womb. Then we will see that it was characterized by open hearts. And then finally by an open mouth. But we'll pick it up at verse 57 in that section, open womb, verses 57 and 58. It says, "Now Elizabeth's full time came for her to be delivered, and she brought forth a son." And you can stop there for just a moment. This doesn't seem to be much of a big deal here. This woman is pregnant, full time came, 9 months, she delivers and gives birth to a son. What's the big deal? Countless women the world over do this every single day. What's the big deal? The big deal is that the big deal is found in what we do not know about Elizabeth, if we're just jumping in right now. Now, you're in Luke chapter 1. We're going to spend all of our time in Luke chapter 1. I want you to just back up to verse 5 with me so that we can get some detail as to why this birth of this son is such a big deal. Verse 5 of Luke chapter 1 says, "Now there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, of the division of Abijah. His wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth." That's the same character that we're talking about in verse 57, this Elizabeth, and her husband is Zacharias. It goes on to say in verse 6, "And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless." I mean, that's a good report, right? They're walking, notice that description, they're both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. Living a blameless life doesn't mean they were sinless. It just means that it was hard to pin anything wrong on them. Not that they didn't ever do anything wrong. Doesn't mean perfection. But it just means that they had a desire to be righteous. And it says in verse 7, "But they had no child." Now that's an important quick point to make, and then we'll move on. And that is this, that you can be obedient to the Lord 100%. But that does not guarantee that everything is just going to be sunny and smooth sailing and there won't ever be any rough seas. There will be rough seas for God's people. We, those of us that are Christians, experience hardships just like everybody else in the world does. The difference is that we have God and God's Holy Spirit to navigate, to walk us and lead us through those scenarios. Nevertheless, verse 7, they had no child, and here's why they had no child. Because Elizabeth was barren, meaning her body could not produce a child. Not that it just could not produce a child, she could not even get pregnant. She was barren, and they were both well advanced in years. So they had two things against them, and that was that Elizabeth was not able to birth a child, not able to give birth, but also it's a very nice way of saying they were old. They were both well advanced in years. I like the way that they put that. If you are in math class and, that student that just always gets 100s, they're going to ace their final this week, and you just hate them for it. They're well advanced, Maybe you're better at science, but they've got math covered or whatever. But you maybe some subject where you're just struggling, but you've got somebody that's well advanced. I like the way that they put that. Oh, they were both well advanced in years, meaning that they were old. That would indicate to us, at least hint to us, that they were beyond the years of childbearing. Plus, she was barren. They had both of those things going against them. So when we read in verse 57 now Elizabeth full time came for her to be delivered, and she brought forth a son, it's quite remarkable that she was even able to give birth at all, and then obviously to give birth to a son. Now, it goes on to say in verse 58. Now, what we're seeing there, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this. Verse 13, actually. Look at verse 13, still in Luke chapter 1. "But the angel said to him, 'Do not be afraid, Zacharias,'" talking to the dad, "'for your prayer is heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John, and we'll get to the name calling in just a few minutes, but there was an open womb, and that was a promise fulfilled. You might even say that it was a prayer answered. As we saw there in verse 13, evidently Zacharias had been praying for his wife to be pregnant for many, many years. Back then, and I still hold this view now, but back then, to not have children, or I should say it this way, to have children was a blessing. There are many in our world today, in our society today, that have the mindset of children as a burden, and that to have a child is not a blessing. But in God's economy, in God's the way that God sees and views things, having children is a blessing. And so it was back then. If you did not have children, it would have been somewhat of a shameful thing, an embarrassing thing to not have children. And so they didn't have children, but Zacharias had evidently been praying for a long time. And now he's been given this promise. Your prayer is heard. Your wife is pregnant. She will give birth to a son. And you're going to call his name John. And again, we'll get to that name calling in a few minutes. But look at this in verse 58 of this section, Open Womb. We see now that there was praise for mercy shown. In verse 58, when her neighbors and relatives heard how the Lord had shown great mercy to her, they rejoiced with her. You bet they did. This is no ordinary pregnancy. This is no ordinary birth. Every day, like I said, there's an announcement made that there's a woman pregnant somewhere throughout the world. We see it all the time on our social media. It's a big deal, as well as it should be. But we have gender reveals, with balloons and rockets and all sorts of craziness to reveal the gender to everyone. Here it is. This is what we're having. Having a child is a big deal. Even more so for an older couple who was beyond the age of childbearing, and even more so for a woman who was barren and not able to even get pregnant. It's funny how God did that, how you remember, some of you will remember Sarai from the Old Testament, Abram's wife, Sarai. And the fact that she was barren, that's the only description we're given of her. We're introduced to her in chapter 11 of Genesis. And the one thing that it says about her is she was barren. That's what she was characterized by. That's what she was known for. And yet, we read in the following chapter 12 of Genesis, where God is talking to Abram and says, he's promising, you are going to have a family. You're going to have a child. You're going to have children. And God will do that. He'll take someone who is seemingly broken, who society considers to be kind of this outcast. Well, they might be nice people, sweet people, kind people, but, they're really not, this is really not their thing. It's really not their gig. And God can take that person and use them for something miraculous. And he did this with John the Baptist. And so everyone, as we see here in verse 58, the neighbors and relatives, when they heard how the Lord had shown great mercy to her, they rejoiced with her. Now, make note that God giving them a child, and not just any child, but John the Baptist, was mercy. God was having mercy on them. As God considered the individuals, the people that he wanted to perform this miracle through, he saw Zacharias and he saw Elizabeth. And he had mercy on them and said, I'm going to give them a child. He was going to restore what they had been missing out on for so many years. He had mercy on them. And because of that, we're told in verse 58 that all of her neighbors and relatives rejoiced with her. It's a good thing. It's a sweet thing. Sometimes, especially, in any kind of scenario, but sometimes even when someone is blessed with a child and the woman is pregnant, the wife is pregnant, and, they're getting things ready, and, they're posting pictures on Instagram of, what the nursery looks like and what they picked out and all those different things and the colors in the crib and all these wonderful things. There are oftentimes other people who are jealous. Maybe they're not able to have children, or maybe they just, whatever it is that, they decide, but oftentimes they're jealous. But not so in this scenario. Her neighbors and relatives, and by the way, her neighbors and her relatives were probably the same people. They probably all lived in the same vicinity, even her family, but even neighbors that weren't related to her. Everyone was rejoicing because of the mercy shown to her. They were rejoicing. Now, we move into the second section, which is open hearts. And let's find out why, what's going on with with the open hearts. Verse 59. So it was on the 8th day that they came to circumcise the child. And they would have called him by the name of his father, Zacharias. But his mother answered in verse 60 and said, No, he shall be called John. Now, on the 8th day, they would bring the child to a ceremony, a circumcision ceremony. Okay? Now, if you do not know what circumcision is, God bless you. Okay? The leaders will be available. They can answer any questions that you have about circumcision. I will go so far as to say that circumcision is a minor surgery that is performed on male children only. Okay? So it's this minor surgery, and they would do this on the 8th day. Now, does anybody know why they waited 8 days to circumcise the child? Anybody know why that was? It is because your blood, when you're first born, now it's not like this anymore, and I'll tell you why in just a moment, but it's because it takes 8 days for the baby's body to develop to the point that the blood begins to coagulate. Coagulate means it begins to clot, it begins to thicken. Prior to that 8th day and that blood coagulating, if the child were to sustain a terrible cut, it's possible that the baby would lose a lot of blood because the blood doesn't thicken. It doesn't stop. It just keeps flowing. And so they would wait the 8 days to perform this minor surgery. And this was a big deal. It was a ceremony. People were invited, no doubt neighbors and family. They would want everybody there. You know, you might get the picture of a gender reveal. You know, everybody's there, and you know, we're on, you know, Instagram Live or whatever, and here it is. We want the whole world to see this, you know. And so this would have been a big deal. They're there for this circumcision ceremony, and it says that they came to circumcise the child, and they would have called him by the name of his father Zacharias. And so it was tradition to not officially name the baby until the day of the circumcision. Seems funny, huh? For the first 7 days, what do you call the child? Doesn't have an official name. You know, so different. And no doubt, I mean, obviously with this couple specifically, they already knew what the baby's name was going to be. It was going to be John. But no doubt, even parents, you know, other parents, you know how they, you know, parents, you know, they dream of names. I mean, some of you probably in here, no doubt, some of you young ladies, you're already thinking about what you want to call your children when you get married and start having kids. And you've got a name for all 13 of them. You just know already, like, hey, yeah, this is what they're going to be called. And, you know, we have books filled with names of babies and all what the babies' names mean. And, you know, you're already thinking that way. And that was absolutely the case for this couple because they already knew what the baby's name was supposed to be. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But you'll notice in verse 59 that as it was time to circumcise the child, they would have called him by the name of his father Zacharias. So that was normal. That's just what you do. You have a baby and you give him your name. You give him a family name. Some of you have a family name. You might be named after your parents. You might be named maybe after a grandparent. Maybe it's an aunt. So some of you are familiar with that. Well, at that day and in that time, they would have just named this baby after Zacharias. That's the normal thing to do. You just name the child after his father. Now, I love this. There's another little point here. I think it's a big deal. To me, it's a big deal. And that is that here again we have, not only does God take this woman who's not able to have children and makes her able to have children, but now God goes outside of that box that these people were holding him in. Well, God, you know, we only do things this way, and it's tradition, and, you know, this is the only way it works, and it's got to fit inside here, and if it doesn't fit inside here, then it doesn't work. And God says, well, we're not doing that. We're not naming him Zacharias. We're going to name him John. By the way, John means Jehovah is a gracious giver. And he certainly was a gracious giver in giving John the Baptist, but even more so in giving Jesus. So as John grows up and he's preparing the way for Jesus, every time someone calls John the Baptist, they're saying to him, hey, Jehovah is a gracious giver. Hey, Jehovah is a gracious giver. What are you doing today? Hey, Jehovah is a gracious giver. Where are you going today? Hey, Jehovah is a gracious giver. You sure you want to wear that camel hair coat? Hey, Jehovah is a gracious giver. You sure you want to eat that locust and that wild honey? So every time they called his name, whether they knew it or realized it or not, they were looking to Jesus. Jehovah is a gracious giver. See, because his very name, everything about him, but even his name was pointing to the fact that God was going to give Jesus this wonderful Christmas gift. John the Baptist, as he got older, he said he about Jesus, he must increase, I must decrease. It was John's his intention, his entire job for Jesus to increase on the scene and for his own life to fade out. He had no desire to, for stardom or to be popular, to get the popular vote, to get followers. He even sent his own followers off to go follow Jesus. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He said, there he is. Go follow him. His disciples one time came to him and said, hey, Jesus and his disciples, they're over there baptizing more people than we are. What are we going to do about it? Nothing. That's what we want. That was his whole point. So even his name was pointing to the fact that Jehovah is a gracious giver. He's pointing to Jesus. But here in verse 59, he says, and they would have called him by the name of his father Zacharias. And here is the open heart. His mother answered and said, no, he shall be called John. Think about the scenario here. They're circumcising their firstborn son. Everyone's there. Not only the individual who's doing the circumcision, but family, friends, no doubt. It's a big deal. They probably would have got together and had some kind of party, and, somebody brought, tamales, and somebody else brought, the sodas, and someone else brought the potato salad, and, someone else brought the whatever, they brought all this stuff. Everybody says, potluck, come on, let's all party. And everybody's there. And as they say, okay, we're going with the norm. We're just following, this is how we do it. The baby's name is going to be Zacharias. And here's Elizabeth, this older lady, who says, no, we're calling him John. And look at their response in verse 61. But they said to her, there is no one among your relatives who is called by this name. Elizabeth, her heart was open to God's will. And anything that supported that. That's the kind of heart that you and I want. That's open to whatever God wants to do. Doesn't matter what the popular vote is, what everybody thinks should happen. Doesn't matter what everybody's telling me, you should do this, or call it this, or name it this, or go here, or do these things. None of that matters unless it is in accordance with God's will. Elizabeth had a heart that was open to God's will, and whatever went along with that. And when something went against that, in this case, the name of her baby boy, Zacharias, she says, no, that's not the way it's going to be. His name is going to be called John. Imagine that. Some of us would melt away right now, and we would just melt and we would disappear into the cracks of the floor if we were asked to come up here and in front of everybody and introduce yourself. Some of you would love it, but some of you would just melt away like, no way. If you're going to do that, you might as well just kill me. And yet this woman, Elizabeth, with her heart open to God and to whatever it was that God desired, is willing to tell the entire crowd, no, we're not doing that. His name's going to be called John. John? Who in the world is John? Nobody's in your family is named that here in verse 61. There is no one among your relatives who is called by this name. This is hilarious to me in verse 62. So they made signs to his father what he would have him called. In other words, crazy old lady, don't ask her. Where's her husband? She didn't know what she's talking about. Let's ask the father, Zacharias. Zacharias, he's the leader. He's a priest. He'll set her straight. This crazy old lady trying to, take charge, whatever. Well, look at this. In verse 63, they get confirmation. Verse 63 says, and he asked for a writing tablet. Isn't that crazy? They had iPads back then. And wrote, saying, his name is John. So they all marvel. They get this confirmation of the name. Confirmation from the dad Zacharias. But I want you to see that just like his wife Elizabeth, his heart also is open to whatever it was that God desired. And if God desired to do something that was outside of tradition, against tradition, Zacharias was okay with that. He was good with that. His heart was open to whatever God's will desired, whatever it was that God wanted. That's what he wanted. In verse 13, earlier in your chapter, and I believe we read this already, but I'll read it one more time here. It says, but the angel said to him, and announcing this news to Zacharias originally, do not be afraid. Remember that? Zacharias, for your prayer is heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. You shall call his name John. Imagine that. But God oftentimes will call us to do things that are, maybe it's not a matter of breaking the law, but it'll go against everyone's expectations, against everyone's suggestions, against everyone's counsel. It doesn't happen all of the time, but it happens often enough that God does something, again, outside of the norm, outside of the box. Choosing a barren woman and this old couple to give birth to this John the Baptist. Choosing a young virgin teenager to become pregnant with the Son of God, Jesus, God in flesh. And God does this countless times throughout the Bible. Countless stories where God did this. You and I oftentimes can have a view of ourselves that maybe is in accordance with what society tells us. Lazy teenager, or you're just disrespectful, or or you're just a dumb kid. You don't know what you're talking about. Whatever. We may have those thoughts in our minds. Maybe we've heard it from other people, and we may start to think those things about us. But in God's economy, anything is possible. Anything is possible. And what we need to do is find ourselves with the same mindset, same heart set as Elizabeth and Zacharias. Well, you know what, God? Whatever you want to do. You want to give us a child? Fantastic. You want to name him John? You name him whatever you want. It's up to you. Totally up to you. I remember years ago at the previous church that I was at, I was teaching on a Sunday morning and teaching through the story of Abram and his wife Sarai. And the fact that they were going to have a child in their very old age. In fact, they were beyond, as far as their age, they were beyond the age of having children. And yet God had promised you're going to have a child. And I remember sometime after, a lady in the church, a sweet lady, a couple, her and her husband, they had some older kids already. And she was not having any babies. She was already older. And she came to me and she says, you remember when you taught on Abram and Sarai? I said, yeah. She goes, remember when you said that, hey, you never know. God might give you a baby in your old age. And I said, yeah. She goes, well, I'm not pregnant. She said, but, and what happened was, the story was she was going to be adopting a small child from one of her family members who could no longer care for the child. And she was teasing me and saying, man, I never should have come that day. But God can do things that you never thought possible. There's no way I can do that. There's no way I can accomplish that. No way that's going to happen. Zacharias and Elizabeth found out, no, it can't happen. With God, all things are possible. So here he asks for a writing tablet, and he confirms his name is John, so they all marvel. That takes us into our third and final section, which is open mouth. It says in verse 64, immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue loosed, and he spoke, praising God. Now, like the news about Elizabeth bearing a son, if we're just looking at verse 64, we go, okay, his mouth was open and his tongue was loosed. Sounds, kind of sloppy to me. I don't know. Like, what does that mean? Jar Jar Binks or what? I don't understand. Like, what do you mean his mouth was open, his tongue was loosed? Well, look at verse 20 of the same chapter, Luke chapter 1, verse 20. The angel is speaking to Zacharias and says, "But behold, you will be mute and not able to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their own time." Now, Zacharias didn't believe the message from God through the angel that day. He questioned it. And because of that, the angel said to him in verse 20, because you questioned, because you didn't believe, I'm taking your power of speech until all of these things are fulfilled. That means 9 months. For 9 months, Zacharias could not speak. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Sometimes it was a good thing for his wife, I'm sure. You know, maybe that took away his power of snoring also. It's like, oh man, never slept so well in 9 months. You know, this is great. I don't know. But certainly it would have been many times of frustration, right? Zacharias, what do you think about these new curtains I bought? Got no opinion, right? Kept himself out of trouble. You know, maybe just give a thumb, you know, in his mind, I hate him, but, you know, I can't say nothing, you know, whatever. But you know, no doubt there were times of frustration throughout that time. But this is another fulfilled promise here in verse 64, because the angel said, I'm taking your power of speech, and you're not getting back until these things are fulfilled. Promise fulfilled. I want you to see something in verse 64. Immediately his mouth was open and his tongue loosed. It happened immediately. The moment that John says, he motions, can't speak. Give me a writing tablet, he's saying. They bring him a writing tablet. Probably was a portion of clay that he could have written things on in that clay. And he gets that, and what he writes down there is, it told us there in verse 63, what he wrote was 4 words, his name is John. He turns that around so that everybody can see that writing tablet, and when they see that his name is John, immediately at that moment his mouth was opened, his tongue was loosed. Meaning he got his power of speech back, and the first thing he begins to do is to praise God. But I want you to understand something about that in verse 64. He did not get his power of speech back until he exercised his faith. See, we oftentimes are praying for, God, I just want to know the way. I just want to, you just tell me. And it may be that God impresses something on your heart. Okay, this is what I want you to do. And you start to feel like, no, I think I need to do this. Except, God, what I want you to do is I want you to just open up the entire road. Just show me the yellow brick road, and I want to be able to see Oz over there, the great and powerful. And, I just want to see the whole, can't you just let me see that it's a clean, straight, easy, safe path? No, can't see that. What you can see is you'll see the road begin to open up, but what you have to do first is take a step. That is oftentimes how faith works. You're praying for something, and God, you sense, is telling you, okay, we'll move in this direction. I'll move in that direction, except I don't know what's beyond that. Yeah, that's the point of faith. And it is oftentimes not until you and I decide, okay, here we go, you take a step, then the next step opens up. And then you take another step, and the next step opens up. That's how faith works. John did not get his power of speech back until the moment that he exercised his faith. And he told everyone, he proclaimed to everyone there, his name is John with his writing tablet. His name is John. Once he did that, that was an act of faith. It was faith in God's promise, the promise that he had received from the angel earlier. Once he did that, 9 months earlier, 9 months and 1 week earlier, as a matter of fact, or however 9 months prior to. And once he exercised his faith by saying his name is John, then he gets his power of speech back. Keep that in mind, because faith can be a very scary thing. Because what we want, I want to see the entire, God, can't you just show me the entire plan? No, I can't show you the entire plan. Because there are things along the way of that plan that you may not like. And you may decide that, oh, I like the beginning, but I don't really like the middle. The end looks okay, but the stuff in between, no, let's pick a different path. God, no, this is the path. Remember the sheep from Psalm 23? Remember them? The Lord is my shepherd, so I shall not be in want. I don't have any needs. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Remember that? He restores my soul. Beautiful, right? If the sheep had been told ahead of time, hey, it's a great spot, right? Yeah, it's a great spot, man. By the still waters, we're in the green fields, everything is good. Okay, yeah, that's good. Except see the valley of the shadow of death right there? We're going to go through that. If they had been told ahead of time, do you think the sheep would have gone? They would have looked and thought, I'm not going. I'd rather just stay here. But staying in the lowlands, I mean, it's okay. It's good. It's the still waters. There's the green grass, yes. But in order to get to the high country, you've got to go through the valley of the shadow of death, except no problem because you've got a shepherd with you leading you. But we can't get there unless we start moving. So let's start moving. But if he shows us the entire path, we're going to see that middle section and go, oh, no, God, why don't you come up with another plan? Let me know when you got something better. Something easier, something nicer, something cleaner, something safer. God is telling you, no, I'll be your safety. Doesn't matter how dangerous it is, I'll be your safety. You just come with me. Take a step, follow me, let's go. And so he shows us one step at a time. That's how faith works so often. And it is scary. It is scary, but it's also fulfilling when we understand, okay, God's telling me I need to move in this direction. Okay, here I go. We take a step and then boom, the next step opens up. And we follow God step by step as he develops our faith. Immediately his mouth was open. Immediately upon exercising his faith, immediately the promise is fulfilled. And he's able to speak again. And the very first thing he does is praise God. Way different from you. You don't remember when you were a little baby. What was the first word that you said? No. Little brat. That's how babies are so often, right? No, it might be mama, it might be dada, or whatever, whatever the word is. But we learn the word no pretty quickly. And mom and dad say, hey, don't touch that. No. What did you just say to me? When did you learn that? Who taught you? Did your dad teach you that? But the very first words that come out of his mouth, out of Zechariah's mouth, is praise for God. Fulfilled promise. And then finally, in verses 65 and 66, as we finish up, there was fear because of all these things. Verse 65, then fear came on all who dwelt around them. And all these sayings were discussed throughout all the hill country of Judea. I love it. No social media, no Facebook, no, Instagram, no Be Real, no TikTok, no nothing, no email, no texting, but everybody's just talking, man. They're talking Facebook. Oh, man, did you hear what happened? Zechariah and Elizabeth, man, they had a baby, and oh, I was there. Zechariah's mouth opened. That was incredible. All these things were happening. They named the kid John. Scandal of all scandals, right? Name is John. All of the details. It says in verse 65 that fear came on all who dwelt around them. What's going on? What's happening? What has God got cooking? It said all these sayings were discussed throughout all the hill country of Judea. Man, the hills were just aflame with all of this news. And in verse 66, all those who heard them kept them in their hearts. Meaning they talked about it in verse 65 with one another. But then, after they left and went back to their homes, all of these details in the news and what people said and what they heard and what they saw, they kept that in their heart. They pondered it and thought about it. That happened with Mary, remember? Mary got news and she kept it in her heart and pondered all of those things that had happened. The same people here, as they experienced this, they kept it in their hearts. And here's what they said in their heart. We get a little peek into what they were saying within their own hearts. They kept these things in their hearts, and they said, what kind of child will this be? Well, you and I, we know what kind of child this will be. right? This is Elijah, not reincarnate, but he's coming in the spirit and power of Elijah. We know what this little baby boy is going to do eventually, that he's going to turn the hearts of the children back to the fathers and the fathers back to the children. He's going to begin to set things straight and prepare the way for Messiah. That's what he's going to do. He's going to be baptizing people. We know that because we've read the scriptures before. And had these people been familiar with Malachi, and had their Bible teachers been teaching them, they would have known, oh my goodness, this is him. This is the forerunner. This is the messenger. This is Elijah. And certainly as he grew, that became very, very obvious. But he says there in verse 66 at the very end, and the hand of the Lord was with him. And it certainly was. John's life was dedicated from start to finish. In fact, we read in an earlier story that John the Baptist was filled with the Spirit even from his mother's womb. Even from the time that he was a baby inside of his mother's womb, before he was even born. Filled with the Spirit. And his entire life was dedicated. Even giving his life in a jail cell, losing his head because of what he believed and how he condemned Herod and said, you're not living right. His entire life was about pleasing God, serving God, preparing the way for Jesus. We want to be that same way, right? We don't want to be that same way. We don't want to lose our head or be in prison, but we all want to be sold out, right? We want that. We want to be like John the Baptist in that sense. This is an incredible life and an extraordinary birth, and it's a birth that would lead up to the birth of Messiah, and Jesus would be born some 6 months later, and we will look at that next time. Actually, next time we'll see the Song of Zacharias, and then after that we'll see the birth of Jesus. But let's go ahead and pray. Father, thank you so much for this morning.